Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Truma is Perek Zayin Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Samach Gimel. We're starting on Daf Samach Beis Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid at the end of the line. And we are up to discussing the Machloikis between Rabbi Yochanan and Eish Lakish in the sugya known as Chayave Malkus Shoigeg, which means, first of all, we have the rule that is sometimes referred to as kam lei b'derabba minei, and which means that if a person does one act that is in violation of more than one lav, and each one of them have different levels of punishment, the violator, as a rule, will not be penalized with both punishments, but he's going to get, so to say, the rabba minei, the greater one, the more serious one, and he won't be demanded or he won't be obligated in the lesser one. And just to say the words that we have in the Achrayim, that either we understand that the one that he won't be held accountable for is because it's subsumed in the punishment that is meted out on him. So let me just apply it to our topic when we're learning that if a person does a violation for which you're both chayiv malchus and you're chayiv to pay. So there's a rule, ein loike u'mishalim. Why is it that ein mishalim? Either because the payment is subsumed in the punishment of the malchus, or even deeper, because we say that the act for which one would be chayiv to pay money, that act is subsumed in the act for which you're chayiv malchus. So it's not only that we won't met out the punishment, it's almost as if you're not even chayiv the other one, with consequences on either side. And maybe we'll come back to this chakira when we learn through today's daf. But coming back, both Rabbi Yochanan and Eish Lakish are of the opinion that, again, when you do one act for which you're chayiv both malchus and money, you're not going to do both. But loike ve'ein mishalah. But that's only when you get malchus. What happens if a person does that act b'shoigeg? It's called chayavi malchus shoigeg. For shoigeg, you're not going to get malchus. Rabbi Yochanan says, so then you will have to pay. Reish Lakish says that even there you won't have to pay. Now, both of them are in agreement, as we learned yesterday, to the Tani Devei Chizkiya, that the same concept of kam lei b'derabba minei apply to when a person does an act for which they're chayiv to be a capital punishment in Beis Din, chayiv misa. That same act could also be machayiv them to pay money. Same idea. We don't say, well, not first get killed and then pay. Once you're dead, you can't pay. We don't say pay and then you're going to be put to death. We don't do that. You're only chayiv the more serious one. You're chayiv misa. Over there, everyone agrees that even if actually in the case, you won't be chayiv misa. You know why? Because you killed b'shoigeg. Since it's an act for which, had you done it b'mezid, you will be chayiv misa, everyone agrees that you won't have to pay. Question is, do we apply that same rule also by malchus and mamain? That was the machlekes that we had. Rabbi Yochanan says only when you're chayiv malchus are you exempt from money. When you're chayav malchus b'shoigeg, you'll have to pay the money. And Eish Lakish says, even chayavi malchus b'shoigeg, you still will be exempt from money. Appreciate how all of this is really leading into a problem with the Mishnah that we are learning. But before we go on, before we get there, the Gemara today is going to quote a third way of reconciling the contradiction. And I think it's important in the word of our Hagdama to chazer the contradiction. There's a contradiction between two Mishnayos in Makis in Bavli Daf Yud Gimel. The Mishnah there, when it speaks about people who violated certain sins for which the chayiv malchus, elu hein haloikin, one of the sins for which your chayiv malchus is if a person, God forbid, cohabits with his sister. Chayiv malchus. Really, it's chayiv kodesh. We know that, but you're chayiv malchus in a human court. Problem is that we have a Mishnah in Ksubos, in Bavli Daf Chav Tes. There, the Mishnah is speaking about another terrible thing. A person who violates a maiden, for which the chayiv to pay 50 shekel kesef. And as we mentioned yesterday, that's a side of boishes, and that's a side of pigam. But aside of that, there's a knas of 50 shekel kesef. And when the Mishnah is giving examples of someone who's ma'anes and nara, for which is chayiv the knas, one of the examples the Mishnah gives is if a person, God forbid, violates a sister. Now we got a problem. What's the problem? Well, violating the sister or having an act of cohabitation with the sister, violated or not, regardless, is chayiv malchus. So if you're chayiv malchus and we have the rule that ein loiko mishalim, how can the Mishnah Ksuba say that you're chayiv to pay the 50 shekel kesef? That's the kasha that we began the sugya with. So yesterday was Rabbi Yechanan, yesterday was Reish Lakish. Today we're going to have a third approach of Nasan Bar Hoshaya. And let me just speak out what he says. He says a gavaldik thing. He also says that he consents with the concept of Kam Levi de Rabbi. He doesn't follow the shita of Rabbi Meir, that whenever you have two lavim that are quoted in different parts of the Torah, then you will be chayiv both punishments. No, you're not. But unlike Rabbi Yechanan, unlike Reish Lakish, that says that if you have to pick and choose, which one do you get malchus? Which one are you exempted thereof is from payment? Loike ve'ena mishalim, Nasan Bar Hoshaya holds mishalim ve'ena loike. Amazing. He holds that paying is more serious. Now we're going to have what's the source? We're going to see how that resolves this contradiction in Mishnayos. But after we do all that, what are we going to come back to? We're going to come back to our Mishnah. I'll tell you the truth. We're not only going to come back to our Mishnah of Ha'oichel Truma Mezid. Why? What's the kasha aviv? Ha'oichel Truma Mezid, you're chayiv malchus. Why do you have to pay? Even the keren. Really, the kasha will also be on last chapter. Oichel Truma Shoigig. What does Reish Lakish hold? That even Chayave Malchus Shoigigin, even though you're not going to get Malchus Shoigig, you still won't have to pay. So would you get Malchus or would you just get nothing? What was that? According to Reish Lakish, what would you get? Nothing. Nothing. So really, as we'll see, that this sugya won't only be, that will be a problem. We're going to see basically how Nasan Bar Hoshaya will understand how those rules coexist with our sugya. We're going to see how Rabbi Yechanan reconciles, and the most challenging one will be Reish Lakish, and we'll get to that as well. Okay, we'll leave it at that, and let's go right inside. Samach Beis Amid Beis. A warm welcome back to Kevan Daniel Ben Rivka, and guys, Samach Beis Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. And again, Machloikis, Rabbi Yechanan, and Reish Lakish, Chayave, Malchus, Shoigigin, whether you are exempt of money or not, says the Gemara, Hakol Moedim, both of them, both Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish agree. She'ein mamin eitzel misa. Ein mamin eitzel misa means that if a person does a sin for which, had they done it b'mezid, they would have been chayav misa, even though they didn't do it b'mezid. They're not going to be chayav misa. They will still be exempt from a financial payment. By the way, this shows that mammon and misa, the lower punishment is not subsumed in the oynish, because there's no oynish misa for you to say that it somehow included in it money. No, it didn't. There was no misa. It means that the misa subsumes any other consequence. When you look at the act, an act of murder is not an act of damage, even though there's also financial damage. It's not seen that way. It's only an act of murder. And therefore, whether the person will be punished for the murder or not, all that he did was murder. It's subsumed in the maisa, not in the oynish. That's l'kola alma. And how do we know that? It's amazing. T'chsiv, we learned this in the Bavli. These are good sugis. T'chsiv, because it says, and we're quoting a pasuk that we have almost towards the end of the portion of Emor. In the same verse, in the same pasuk, Hashem puts together 2 completely separate dinim, and they're not connected. What the pasuk says, "Make behema yishalmeno." If a person hits or damages an animal, right, an animal or someone else's property, we're speaking about when the animal is someone else's property, then they have to make financial restitution to the animal's owner. Umaka adam. If a person strikes another man, striking another man doesn't mean damages. It means murder. He has to be put to death. Nufregich did. In the same verse, damaging an animal, killing a person. In LA, it makes sense. In LA, damaging an animal is worse than killing a person. But that's only here. What do you do in the normal parts of the world? So the Chazal learn a hekesh, daf samach gimel on the top, to tell you that we compare the dinim to each other, which is ma makeh just like when it comes to the law of damaging, in this case, someone else's animal, which is someone else's property. We do not differentiate bein shoygig, bein mezid, l'chayv mamain. This is the most important rule. When it comes to financial responsibility, it makes absolutely no difference whether the damager did so intentionally or unintentionally, right? If I'm driving my car and my brakes fail and I knock into your car and I'm going to tell you, oh, it was an accident, I'm only saying those words for you not to think that I was trying to hurt you. So, but just because I never say that to tell you, well, I don't have to pay you because it was an accident. No. It was an accident, so don't be angry at me. It was an accident. I'm not a malicious person. I'm not a mazik person, but I'm chayiv to pay. Financial restitution has nothing to do with your intent or not. Af makei yodam, that, in other words, you're always going to be chayiv. Af makei yodam, like tacha, like boy. The Torah is telling you, do not differentiate bein shoygig, bein mezid liptur, which means that the rule that when you do one act, which is an act of murder, of makei adam meaning killing a man, that if that same act is also an act of damages, for which normally you would be chayv to make financial restitution. And we have the rule that you don't get both punishments. You only get the punishment of death. The Torah is telling you, don't differentiate between mezid and shoygig. Just like the mezid, when you murder, you're going to be put to death. You won't be chayv anything else other than being put to death. You will not be obligated to any financial restitution. Come lay b'derabba. Even when a person kills b'shoygig, which means that in that scenario, they won't be put to death in a Beis Din, but the rule of kam lei b'derabba minei still stands, which is they will not be chayv to pay for damages, even though there's damages involved. Amazing. So everyone agrees to that. From the hekesh, from the juxtaposition of makah behemel yishalmena and makah adam yumas. So that everyone agrees to. And the lumdis is because death and financial restitution, the financial part is subsumed in the act of murder, manslaughter, however you're going to call it in English. But when it comes to an act for which you're chayiv, theoretically, malchus and mamain, and we say, not Rav Meir, we paskin like the chachamim, that you don't get both. Eino loiko u'mishalim, we have a machlokes. B'meh pligin, b'mamain eitzel makis. Rabbi Yochanan says, ein mamain eitzel mitzah. You're right. Eitzel misa, meaning even if the misa will be something for which you're not liable for, you still won't pay. Like you said, Aviv, nothing. But v'yesh mammon eitzel malchus. Only if you get malchus don't you have to pay. But if you're not going to get malchus because there was no hasra, or there was hasra but there were no edim, whatever, however, then you have to pay. Chayave malchus shoygigin chayiv. These are the words. However, Reb Shimon Lakish Amar, no. Kshem she'ein mammon etzel mitzah, kach ein mammon etzel makis. Now, who has to be explained? Which one, Aviv, do you think has to be better explained? If you're looking for a source, Resh Lakish. Why does Resh Lakish have to be explained? Because it's not rational to say that if you don't even get punished for the more serious one, you should also be exempt from the lenient one. Like that's what you were saying. What, you don't get anything? So when it comes to death, we have a source. We have a hekesh. Maka behema yishalmena, maka adam yumas. But that pasuk is only makish, death, not to malchus. So who needs to be justified, Resh Lakish? That's the next line of the Gemara. And Rav Imi from Babylonia, Rav Imi Bavloi, the Shem Rabbanan the Taman, came to the Holy Land, and he quoted the Chevra that a Chachamim in Bavel came up with a source for Resh Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't need a source. Resh Lakish needs a source. Talmud Rav Shimon Lakish, the Chevra, this is great. Rasha, he has a Gezerah Shavam. It's amazing that Resh Lakish's teacher was Rabbi Yochanan. Ein Adam Dam Gezerah Shava Ma'atzmai. That means he learned the Gezerah Shava Rasha from whom? From Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn it the way he learned it. I'll get to that back in a moment. And Resh Lakish does. Now, what are the two Rashas? So Nemar Rasha b'mechiyuvei Misa. Chavra, take a look at the Torah Eira Shalom just to read the whole pasuk. Aleph. right? We're quoting a pasuk in Parshas Masei, towards the end of Parshas Masei. The pasuk says, "Lo yisikchu koifer lenefesh reitzeach." God says, don't accept ransom for murder. I want to say what it means, ransom. There are certain sins for which you could pay ransom. As an example, Aviv, if my animal, God forbid, kills 3 people, not 1 person. Once my animal becomes a muad in killing people, and I, the owner, still did not go out of my way to really look after my animal, to guard it, and it killed a person, the Torah writes the words, V'gam ba'ol of yumas, that the owner should be put to death. And then the next pasuk, that Parshas Mishpatim, that if the person wants, they can pay koifer. If you want, you can pay redemption money. And what's the redemption money? Machlokes tanoim. The may mazik, the may nizik. Anyways, in other words, sometimes the Torah uses the word samanas chayav misa, even though it doesn't really mean the chayav misa. But the Torah says v'gamba all of you must ve'im koifar, and if they want to pay koifar, then the nasan pidyoy nafshi. Here, when it comes to actually nefesh reitzeach, when it comes to murder, makes no difference whether it was intentional, whether it was even inadvertent, for which you have to go into golus. One thing will never be a solution: paying money. Asher hu rasha lamus. Now here, this pasuk is speaking about someone who killed b'mezid, a guy who's a rasha. That means he's wicked. He intentionally killed. What has to happen? Only one thing: kimois yumas. So you have the word rasha. Now, v'nema rasha b'mechiyuvei misois. What's that pasuk? I'm sorry. Next, v'nema rasha b'mechiyuvei makes. What is this pasuk referring to? The pasuk that we have been using, the pasuk that we learned yesterday in Parshas Kiseitze. When the pasuk writes, "V'hoye imbin hakois harasha," if Beis understands that this is a case for which you have to give to the wicked malchus, so then the pasuk says, "V'hipilo hashofet v'kol lefanav kedei rishasei b'mispar." And yesterday we focused on the word kedei rishasei, risha achas. That was the source that the Yerushalmi brought of kam le b'derabamine. But coming back over here, so you have rasha. Here you go. So what does Reish Lakish learn from the Gzeira Shava? Ma Rasha shenem b'mechiyuvei misois, as we just learned from the Hekesh, ein mamain eitzel misa. Ein mamain eitzel misa. That means even when you're not going to be put to death because you killed, not the mezid, but the exemption of money will still stand, not death nor money, nothing in a human court. Rasha teaches you af Rasha shenem b'mechiyuvei makes. Ein mamain eitzel makes. Gzeira Shava, ein mama netzel makas. Even if chayave malchus shoygigin, you're not going to receive malchus because you did it b'shoygig. But the exemption that for one act that you would have been chayiv malchus b'mezid, that act cannot be mechayiv you money. That still stands. Some interesting, when we say that we don't make a double hekesh by kachim, but normally you see how we extend the yud gimel midos. You make a double libud. You have a hekesh, then you use a Gzeira Shava. Look how we extend the dinim. Now I want to go back just quickly for the Gzeira Shava. No one can make up their own Gzeira Shavas. You know why? Ein lo davar soif. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer, vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Leimer. If you're going to go with your own logic, you're going to compare every single thing that you want to each other. It doesn't work that way. We have an oral tradition. God told Moshe Rabbeinu which words are used for the Gzeira Shava. And if you didn't hear those words from your teacher or heard it from his teacher, you can't make them up. Everyone was mekabel rasha. But what Hashem did not explicitly tell Moshe was what is it used for. So Rabbi Yechanan has to use the rasha for other dinim. And just remember that. It's not stam. Reish Lakish has the Gzeira Shava and Rabbi Yechanan doesn't. Especially when it comes to these two, even though Reish Lakish also for sure had other teachers, but his main teacher was Rabbi Yechanan. Okay, even though they argued. That's a good student who argues with the teacher. Okay, before we bring this all back to our topic, whoever just came on Ido, here we go. Mishnah, there's a rule. If you do one act for which you chayiv makis and money, you don't get both penalties. Doesn't work that way. The problem is, you have a Mishnah in makis that says that one of the sins for which you chayiv malkis is if a man, God forbid, has a relation with his sister. There's kares, but in the human court, makis. Says in Ksubos, another Mishnah in Ksubos, regarding the dinim of a man who, God forbid, violates a maiden, for which the chayiv to pay 50 shekel kesef and other punishments, but there's a financial knas, no matter who the girl is, of 50. Whenever, just to know, how do you define knas? What differentiates financial restitution versus a penalty? There are two rules. Any time that the dollar number is always the same, that means it's not financial restitution. That means it's a penalty. No, it's for the fact that the Torah says that for the act of violating a maiden, you're chayiv, amongst other things, to pay money, and the money is regardless who the girl was, regardless who the violator was. That's one way that you define a knas. Another way, they go with each other, is that any time that I am giving back to you more or less money that you lost, that means it's a penalty, not a financial restitution. If a man kills a slave, he's chayiv to pay to its owner 30 shekel kesef. Whether the slave was worth 20, whether the slave was worth $1 billion. In other words, whenever the number doesn't match the damage, that's also a knas. It's a knas. I'm saying this because we're going to need that what I just said for today's daf also. Okay, so the kasha is variable. Well, a variable that's called mammon. Mammon means money. Mammon means financial restitution. Not a knas. Yeah. The moment it doesn't match, it's not a knas. Like when I ganve, I have to pay you back double. The original, the first half, is not a knas. It's financial restitution. If I'm paying back more, even if it's double, it's already called knas. If I'm moide, I'm pater from the knas. Moide beknas pater, not moide that I ganve and I don't have to pay anything. That will be a great business. Stealing, being moide and pay back nothing. Okay. So anyways, coming over here. So we have a contradiction. How can the Mishnah write in Ksubas that if a man, God forbid, violates his sister? It's one of the examples when she's a nara. He has to pay 50 shekel kesef. Why? He's chayiv makis, ein loiko mishalim. So now the third, this is the final answer for this question here in the Yerushalmi, and the answer is from Nosan bar Hoshaya. Nosan bar Hoshaya Omar, I'll tell you, very simple. In Mesechta Ksubos, the Mishnah writes that if a man violates his sister, God forbid, he has to pay 50 shekel kesef. We're speaking about a na'ara, and a na'ara is a girl, like we mentioned yesterday. She's not a minor, halachic minor. She's not a mature. She is 12 years old up until 12 and a half. If she began to mature when she was 12 years old, that is where you're chayiv. And what are you chayiv? Money. Don't worry, a lot more will be explained in a moment. However, Khan in Masechta Makos, where the Mishnah writes that if a man violates his sister or has a consensual, God forbid, with his sister, doesn't matter the ma'anas here, but the act of cohabiting with the sister is mechayiv malkis, is bibogeres. It's with a mature girl. Why? What's the difference? The Gemara explains. First of all, just to know the differences. Nara, in general, yesh lakas me'elo mecher. There are certain rights that the father has, obviously responsibilities also, but there are certain rights that a father has over his minor daughter only, and not to be misunderstood. And one of them is that if there is a need to have her, I'm using words that I know that now on the internet, they take these snippets and they put it out there and it doesn't sound good. And there's nothing we can really do for people who want to just take it out of context. But a father has a right to sell his daughter, meaning these are dinim that are relevant, God forbid, at times of great famine, where there isn't enough food, and other families, especially the Torah connects buying a young girl with ultimately marrying her. It would be almost like a pre-shidduch, that since she's going to be marrying that family will take responsibility to feed her. This is when Pashut, there's not enough food for everyone. Anyways, a father has a right to sell his daughter, and that right is only up until when she's a nara. However, in the case where a woman, God forbid, is violated and the knas has to be paid, just to know, who does that money go to? Not to her. She's not yet considered a full-fledged adult. That money goes to the father. In other words, nara, we're speaking about the father's rights. Yesh la knas. If there's a knas, the knas goes to the dad. And there is a knas, b'chlal. There's the 50 shekel that goes to the father, but the ein lo mecher. The father no longer has the right to sell her. By geres, once a girl becomes a adult, halachically meaning she's 12 and a half, if she matured by 12, then not the father has the right, of course not. He doesn't have the right to sell her off when she's a nara. Loy mecher, but here's another din. This whole rule of the knas doesn't apply to her anymore. There is no knas. If there is now, what are we getting to? Let me tell you what we're getting to. Just get a step ahead. Nasan Baroishaya is not going to go to what Reish Lakish says, that these Mishnahs go according to Rabbi Meir. We're not going there. You're not going to be chayiv both. Nasan Baroishaya understands that if you do one act for which you're chayiv malchus and mammon, you only are chayiv mammon. You're not chayiv malchus, as we'll see in a moment. So in Masechta Ksubos, Elu Na'aros, there is a knas by a nara. So the Mishnah says a knas that you're going to be chayiv the knas. You violated any nara, you chayiv 50 shekel kesef. If a man, God forbid, violated noch his sister, he's chayiv 50 shekel. She's a nara, and you taka won't get malchus because you're going to pay the money. In Masechta Makos, ve'eloin haloikin, one of the sins for which you're chayiv malchus is any act of cohabiting with a sister, including if she was violated. Yeah, why will you be chayiv malchus? Because if she's no longer a nara, if she's older, there is no more knas. Just to make it clear, no more knas, not because the sin is less severe. We spoke this out yesterday. God is the judge. God sets the score, settles the score. God at times asks us to partner with him in certain cases. And as a rule, many times for lesser violations, you have a penalty in the Torah. For greater violations, you don't even have a penalty. Like we said, you eat truma b'shoigig, you pay keren v'choimish. You eat it b'mezid, it's worse, right? You don't even have to pay the choimish. We said by Edom Zoimimim, right? Kasher Zamam v'loy kasher rasa. Kasher rasa is worse, no penalty in human court. Anyways, coming back over here, since there is no human penalty,
it seems like an obvious answer. Like this seems way better than everything.
No. It's a very difficult answer, Danny, because we don't go with Rab Nasan Bar Ishaya that you're mishalom ve'eino loika. He has a unique din. Let me tell you better. I know I keep on saying the words "kam le b'derabba minei" because I know these words in my head. The Gemara never said those words. You know what b'derabba minei means? It means you get the more serious punishment. I would argue malchus is more serious than mammon. I know that if a person is very poor, they might say otherwise, but I think objectively, getting malchus is much more serious. So he says mishalom ve'eino loika. It's easier, you're right, Danny, but that's only if you agree with him. No one else agrees with him. He's a unique opinion. Now, one second. Before we go on, we still have a problem. And we mentioned this, that when it comes to a person violating someone else, I know that the knas of 50 shekel kesef, the Torah writes nara, and the whole kiseitz. It's all about a nara. But one second. But then you have financial restitution. For every act of damage, really, there's the potential of 5 different types of financial restitutions. One of them will be shame. Shame is considered financial restitution. One is called pigam, that she became devalued. So, okay, so if you're coming with the premise that how do you have a Masechta Makis that loikin because she was already a begetis? Okay, I know. By a begetis, you don't have the 50 shekel knas. But what about the other financial penalties? So for that, the Gemara says it must be that the Rabbanan of Kesadan said that the Mishnah Makis is speaking about either ve'elin aloikin, that he seduced her. And just to know, when a woman willingly consented to seduction, if she's an adult, not if she's a minor who willingly consents, it's called an act of violation. Pitui, ktanis, oinis, it's an act of rape. But if a woman is already begetis, her consenting in that is a renouncement of any financial claim because she consented. And there you won't have to pay boishes a pigam. She consented. Or knas, you cannot be moichel. We already learned this. Because knas is not about the losing party getting back what they lost. Knas is about the violating party getting an atonement. So the 50 shekel kesef you cannot forgive. But boishes, pigam, or if there were other financial damages, if the other side decides to forgo, to forgive, to be moichel, then they can be moichel. All finances, you can be moichel a financial debt. It must be, the Mishnah Makos is speaking about that there is no financial. Because if there would be any financial obligation, any financial obligation, what would you be chayiv to get? Only the money and not makis. In other words, Sava Rab Nosson Bar Yeshaya, that b'makim makis v'tashlumin, unlike Rabbi Yechanan, unlike Reish Lakish, no, mishalim ve'eino loika, you pay money. And now we're going to go through what we went through yesterday. First of all, question number one, why not both? And then, if not both, why are you picking money over Malchus? So first of all, the Yerushalmi, for that the Gemara answers, and here again, like we had yesterday, unlike the other reason brought down in the Bavli, of which is speaking about death, which makes sense why we don't bring it here. We're speaking about either makis, money, but not both, because when the Torah says in the pasuk that we just quoted, in bin rasha, and what do? The judges whip him according to his wickedness, and those words are extra, they're superfluous. And we are understanding that, you know why God adds those words? We are hinting that even if there's a case where there are two wickedness, there are two problems. One wickedness, that's mechayev makis. Another, that same act, also has in it another dimension of wickedness, that's mechayev mamain. For that, God writes, you know what you get? Only punished for one. Now, what's the bomb question with this? Bomb question with this is, if you're using Kedei Shisoi as the source, that you're not loika u'mishalem, what does this pasuk say? That's what Rabbi Yechanan said. What does this pasuk say? That v'hi piloi hashoifet v'hi kol lefanav, give him malchus. It's amazing how Rab Nosson Bar Yeshaya has the shoulders to quote this verse and not to apply what it says in this verse. But the question is, at least, what's your other source? So v'yilkev lo yishalem, and here we get the bomb question, yilkev lo yishalem, because the pasuk says v'hiko. Answers the Gemara. I'll tell you, very simple. Every act of Edom Zoymimim, it says in the Ten Commandments, lo yisa'ana bereyacha eit shaker. Don't bear false testimony against your reyacha. It's in the which is a lav, for which theoretically you should be chayiv malchus. Yes, I know that it's the lav she'ein by maisa. We're going to go for this, that akim asfasav hava maisa, especially since what they're saying is consequential immediately in court. Nevertheless, what's the din of Edom Zoymimim? That if two witnesses conspire by lying and saying that Reuven is chayiv $100 to Shimon, what happens if they're caught to be conspiring witnesses? What happens? They don't get flogged. What do? That's the din of Edom Zoymimim. They're going to be chayiv to pay, because whatever they were going to do to the Reuven, they have to do to the Reuven. Clearly, you see that even though there is a general law of loisana beriyacham, by the way, according to Rabbi Meir, shtei shemois, Rav Meir says, taka both. All Edom Zoymimim, they get malchus, loisana beriyacham, check it. It's a shame in the Ten Commandments, a verse in a different context. And aside of that, you through your testimony, based on already paskin, Reuven paid to Shimon, according to the Rambam, by payment, even if Reuven already paid to Shimon, you got to pay. So from there we learn, since eino loike umishalem, so which one do you do? Mishalem ve'eino loike. Now, says the Gemara, Daf Samach Gimel Amud Beis, this is important. Amar Rabbi Nosson, I'll give you the reason of Rab Nosson Bar Yeshaya. I understand, I'm suggesting, why does Rab Nosson give another reason? I'll tell you why. Because why would we learn it from Edom Zoymimim, like I mentioned, if the source from where you learn that you don't get both penalties, Kedei Rishis or Rish Asai, Risha Achas Veloy for two Rishois, if that pasuk tells you give makis, how can you deviate from that verse? And the answer is because he understands this pasuk the opposite of what you said, which is Vipila Hashef Vikol Lefanav Fakert. You know what the pasuk is telling you? Only when do you get malchus? Only if malchus satisfies the risha. The amam is the opposite. Yotza zeh, but when a person who did an act which is a rasha because like they violated the law, compounded with they did an act that they hurt someone else financially, or for which they're going to be chayav financial money or knas so far. If here Yotzazeh, he won't get malchus. Wow, we. In other words, he uses Kedei Shasai, the opposite than we learned it until now. Because if he would have learned Kedei Shisai, the way Rabbi Yechanan learns that this implies two dishes, then how can he go learn from Edom Zaymimim? No, the opposite. The Torah adds superfluous words to tell you, you know when you're Chayiv Malkis? When this is the only act of wickedness. If you did something for which you're also Chayiv money, first of all, you're not going to get both. And not only will you not get both, you won't get Malkis. You're going to have to pay. This is awesome. And now we're finally coming back to our topic. I just want to add one thing, that when we're coming back to our sugya, there are two issues we have to resolve. Even though we mentioned this topic only in the 7th chapter, Oichel Truma Mezid. But now that we learn Shitas Reish Lakish, now we also have to explain Reish Lakish, not only over here. Why is it, Aviv, that if you eat Truma Mezid, how can you pay the Keren? Eating Truma is Machayev Yu Malkis. And even if you didn't get Hasra, you should still not have to pay. Before we get to our Pedic, let's go back to the prior Pedic. What's the previous Pedic? Oichel, Truma, Shoigeg. What did the Mishnah say? What does the Pasuk say? Keren, Chaimish. How can that be? According to Rabbi Yechanan, it's Gavaldik. Why is it Gavaldik? Because Rabbi Yechanan says, Hayava Malki Shoigegin. You're not exempt from payment. Oichel, Truma, B'Shoigeg, you got to pay. According to the Nasan Bar Ishaya, it's also Gavaldik. Bechlal, Makis and money, you got to pay. So, in other words, we're going to bring this back to our topic, but now that we also mentioned the sheet of Reish Lakish, we're going to have to go back to the previous chapter as well, and here we begin. So, Frag the Gemara, Masnisa, our Mishnah. You're going to say, Aviv, it's not a Mishnah, it's a Pasuk. You're right, but we're going to get there in a moment. Seems to be refuting Reish Lakish. Why? Now we're going back to the previous chapter. In our pagination, we started on Daf Nun Hey Yomad Beis Pedic Shishi. It says Ha'oichel Truma Shoigig. You got to pay Kenan v'Chaimish. Why? Why? Now that we learned in the 7th, now that we know it's not written here that if you eat Truma Mezid, then what do you get? If you're warned, you get Malkis. And Reish Lakish says Chayave Malkis Shoigigin will also be exempt from money. Why do you have to pay? So for that, he has a good solution. The same solution he had with the Stira Makas Ksubas. Rab Meir argues. The Shlakish paskins like the Chachamim, as do we, or as we do. But the Mishnah can follow Rab Meir. The Mishnah, the Rab Meir. Very good. What's the problem with the answer, Aviv? You can say a Mishnah follows Rab Meir, but what do you do with the verse? In other words, Reish Lakish, he holds like the Chachamim. And not only Eino Loiko Umeshalem, when you get Malkus, even if you're not getting Malkus, Eino Loiko Umeshalem. Chayavim Makis, Shoyigin, Potter from Mammon. Okay, the Pasuk says, Zor, who eats Kodesh, that you got to give back the Keren and a Chaimish. We'll get to that in a moment. But before that, now let's go to our Mishnah, to our Pedic. So let's go. It feels like the Babli. This Aldate de Nasan Bar Ishaya, who holds Du Amar Mishalem ve'Eino Loika Nicha Noyach. It's Gavaldik. Perfect. Taka perfect. Why is it perfect, Aviv? According to the Nasan Bar Ishaya, we're speaking about a guy who was given a hasra. He was warned, and there were witnesses, which means theoretically he's chayiv malchus. Happens to be also, what did he do? He ate the kohen's truma. He has to financially pay back what he did. So that's why he's not going to get, the Mishnah doesn't say he get makis. So it's perfect. Al dato, even according to Rabbi Yechanan, also, that was the maraful that we learned yesterday. Is Zoichet good? The Omar that he says that only im hisru by loika. But im loy hisru by, right? Chayav makis shoygigin, then mishalem. So about it, pasala, you're going to have to limit our Mishnah. Mazid means mazid, but there wasn't hasra. And again, I'm always adding, it doesn't only mean, it could be there was hasra, but there were no edim. It means l'chora, that makas he's not getting. Problem will be, al dati de Rab Shimon ben Lakish, who says, loy shanya he mazid, he shoygig, em hisrubai, or loy hisrubai. In all scenarios, since it's a sin that carries the penalty of malchus, you should never have to pay. So how can our Mishnah say that you have to pay back the keren. So here again, Reish Lakish will tell you, weiter good. Our Mishnah follows Rab Meir. Saval Rab Shimon Lakish Rab Meir. The Amar Rab Meir loike mishalem. But now comes the bomb question. Bomb question is that Amar Rab Chinanu Kumi Rav Mana the in Yizber Rab Shimon ben Lakish kol masnisa that Rab Meir. Reish Lakish will tell you the whole shas, like they're getting nervous. Everything is Rav Meir, beautiful. So you have a way out. And you hold like the Chachamim who argue with the Mishnah. My friends, this Mishnah is quoting a pasuk. So let's put aside the Mishnayos. Kira, the Rav Meir. Are you going to tell me that a verse only follows Rav Meir? You can't answer that. What's the pasuk? Let's go to the pasuk that we quoted in last chapter in Parshas Emor. The ish ki yoichal kodesh bishgaga. So the Torah says you got to pay back Kenan and the Chaimish. What do you do with that? Beautiful. The Gemara has a great answer. And put on your seatbelt. What did we learn yesterday? At the end of last year, I was trying to get further. We learned the last thing that even though we say kam le b'derabamine, that's only when both punishments, both theoretical punishments, are given over are masur lebezdin. These were the words we had in the Yerushalmi. When they're masur lashamayim, as an example, money and a korban. That was the case of Rabbi Yechanan, that a person ate chalev. And the chayiv b'mezid, the chayiv malchus. But if they didn't know that if he would have done it b'shoigig, you got to bring a korban and a korban. You don't get two penalties. No. A korban is masal hashamayim. The Gemara is going to say, my friends, knas is masal hashamayim. Knas is not considered financial restitution. It's like a korban. What difference does it be? What difference is there if your kapara is coming through bringing a korban or through giving a knas? That the choimish is a korban. So great. Now, the moment we said that, I just want to suggest the whole contradiction is resolved between makis and ksubais, because choimish is a knas, so is the 50 shekel. In other words, if we're going with this svara, that the shlakish will have to say, even though it's money, but it's not viewed as money, you're gonna be loika, and you have to pay the knas. So first of all, we have to answer 1 second. The choimish is the knas. What about the keren? We're gonna get there in a moment. Just right now, we have another solution. That if a man is ma'anis, God forbid his sister, he's chayiv malchus for cohabiting with sister. That you chayiv malchus. 50 you still have to pay. Why? Because it's a korban. It's a knas. It's great. Let's go weiter. Okay, I get it that you can argue that the choimish is like a korban, because a choimish is a knas, like we explained. You didn't take the choimish. It's for me to get a kapara. Okay. Afilu yizber choimish korban, asks the Gemara, what about the keren? If you eat truma shogig, you have to pay keren, korban? The Gemara says, yes. Aviv, why is keren the korban? The way you define a knas is that if I have to give back not exactly what I took, more or less. What did we learn in last chapter? When I eat, God forbid, someone's truma b'shoigig, what do I have to make payment from? From chulin misukanim. What did I eat? Truma. What has more financial value? More. The chulin. That's the Gemara's answer. Amar Rabbi Yudan Bashalu Masnisa Amra. Our Mishnah will hold, according to Reish Lakish, that even the keren is in the category of a knas. The taninon.
Yeah, but then why would you have to give it to the kohen that you took it from?
That's a kasha that we find throughout. Like I said, Danny, by Geneva, everyone calls the kefil part knas. Moide beknas pater. So I'm asking Danny, if I ganvit from you $100, I have to give you $200. Why do I have to give it to you? Why didn't Hashem say, give the $100 to you, I took it from you, and the other $100 give to
So then the chaimish really we should have to give to him also. But we don't say that. We say give the chaimish to any kohen you want.
So the Gabi is asking a good kasha, which is that since the chaimish is a knas, that's how we explain the man's right to give it to anyone. Why does he even have to give the keren back? A good question. But the Tanina, we learned in the previous chapter, and they become truma. Now, ilu mimasha achal hoy mishalim, if the person would be allowed at least the keren to pay back with truma, then yaus, that the payment is called mammon. But the fact that even the keren cannot be done from truma, how great is that? And let me go even more. Just hop one more line in the Gemara note 7 o'clock. Even more than that, because we also learned in a brayse, daf samach daled, daf soid, that if a person ate truma temeya, what did we learn? Lechatchila for sure. You have to be mishalem chulim tohoiden. If im shilem chulim temeim, then yotza. Now let me ask you a question. It's just a bigger contrast. Same idea. Aviv, what's the financial value of truma temeya? The only thing the coin could have done with that is fuel. It's very not valuable. Look at the contrast. And what does the person lechatchila have to pay back with? Chulin misukanim. And nevertheless, he has to pay lechatchila izaraya hada'amra, that even the keren is a knas. We're in middle. We're going to continue tomorrow. Gavaldik. To be continued.